Welcome to our Reclaiming Our Democracy Town Hall. We know we have over 225 people registered. We're not quite sure because we've been having people added at the last minute, so we might hit 250. Thank you for taking time on a December Saturday to be here to think about democracy together. We will be live streaming this session, Electoral Reform for Expanded Representation, and then breaking for lunch around 11:30, and then we will resume live stream at 1 p.m. and continue with a short break until 4. Videos of each session will be posted on our YouTube channel soon so they can be shared and viewed for further discussion at local meetings or at your own leisure. We'll be taking questions along the way from our Facebook stream and also from index cards from members of the audience. So if you came in, think you might have a question and did not pick up an index card, we have Nancy and Charles have index cards and happy to hand them to you if you want to raise your hand now or at any point in the future. They'll come and give you cards. If you have cards, you can just raise them and they will come and get them from you. Before we begin our panel, I would like to talk a little about why we're here and what we hope to accomplish. In the past 2 years, I've traveled across our state, speaking in Oil City and Erie, in Scranton, Lewisburg, Altoona, Reading, about 50 towns and cities in all, in over 30 counties. Wherever I go, I am struck by what a beautiful state Pennsylvania is. How rich in resources and in history and in wonderful people committed to seeing our state and its communities flourish. Thank you for being those people, for setting up those meetings, for greeting me so warmly, and for sharing your communities with me, but with each other, in a way that shows a real bipartisan desire to engage as citizens in making our state work for all of us. William Penn's vision of love and common good allowed Pennsylvania, Penn's woods, to begin in harmony with the 6 nations that preceded European settlement. The early charters pointed the way toward unprecedented participation. The first Constitution, drafted in 1776, granted significant liberties not enjoyed elsewhere and extended the right to vote to any free man who paid public taxes, regardless of color, regardless of wealth. For much of its early history, Pennsylvania was first among equals, the first United States capital, the first U.S. stock exchange, the first U.S. mint, the first and still only women's art school in America, the first theater in America, the first successful oil well. For much of that time, we were a model of representation. The first stirrings of the abolition movement and of the women's suffrage movement took place here in Pennsylvania. But our amazing resources, timber, coal, natural gas, farmland beyond the dream of so many hungry farmers, invited speculators to focus attention on our state and also on those who ran it. The first of the robber barons courted favor with Pennsylvania politicians. In the railroad strikes of 1877, Pennsylvania politicians called out militia to put down strikers across the state, the bloodiest response to organized labor in our nation's history. 16 citizens were shot in Reading, 2 killed in Shamokin, 4 in Scranton, 40 in Pittsburgh. While many states had captains of industry looking for ways to bend the economy, the government, and the militia to do their will, Pennsylvania had more, and they were more successful. The Pennsylvania Society, the annual gathering in New York, historically at the Waldorf Astoria, was begun in 1899 with Pennsylvania steel, coal, oil, and railroad magnates meeting in gilded halls to select their political candidates and to give them instructions for the session ahead. Coal and steel have lost their sway, replaced by shale gas, pharmaceutical companies, and other industries that together spent more than $500 million each year to promote or block legislation in our General Assembly. That's nearly $2 million per legislator. Those dollars would not come to Harrisburg unless there was a very profitable return. While other states pass laws limiting gifts and requiring full disclosure of donations, every attempt at reform here in Pennsylvania is blocked by the same leaders who benefit most fully from those gifts and donations. If you've spent time in our State House watching how our bills are handled, you have seen the many tactics used to shut down reform and ensure the status quo. Power is addictive, and those with power focus great attention on ways to maintain that power while doing all they can to discourage attention from citizens like us, determined to see the system change. For too long, policies supported by a majority of Pennsylvanians, common sense solutions that would benefit us all, have been blocked and stalled by special interests and partisan leaders. Our economy has been harmed, our communities have been harmed, we, the people of Pennsylvania, have been harmed. Pennsylvania has become an outlier in ways that carry a heavy economic and social cost. We have one of the most inequitable school funding models and some of the most underfunded school districts in the nation. We have the largest per capita population of juvenile offenders serving life sentences without parole in the world at a heavy cost with no public benefit. We have 18 cities with worse lead poisoning than Flint, Michigan. We are one of the richest sources of shale gas in the world, and the only major shale state with no shale severance tax, in effect handing one of our greatest resources to an industry that spends millions each year fighting to defund environmental regulation. This is not the first industry that has done this. Pennsylvania has a long history of allowing extractive industries to control the narrative and to take our resources without paying back to the people of Pennsylvania. We are the only state in the country that doesn't provide a state contribution to public defenders. We ignore the constitutional right to counsel and at the same time expand profits for the private prison industry. The list of unjust and economically unsound policies is long and growing longer every year. How did it happen that the state with the first free library does not ensure that elementary schools in our poorest communities have school libraries? How did it happen that a state with a rich history of higher education now spends more on imprisoning our young adults than on educating them for productive futures? How, in a state founded on Penn's vision of brotherly love, common good, and mutual regard, can we allow our legislative leaders to stir division between East and West, urban and rural, children and aging property owners, immigrants and the communities that benefit from new markets and new workers? How did a state that was once the example of representation fall so far behind in election provisions that ensure full electoral participation? We, Fair Districts PA, the League of Women Voters of Pennsylvania, Common Cause PA, Committee of 70, Represent Pennsylvania, March on Harrisburg, dozens of other organizations, and thousands of volunteers across the state, we are working together to reclaim our democracy and to restore representative governance that serves us all well. Together, we will energize the democracy movement, ensure fair elections, and insist on legislative rules that give bipartisan solutions a hearing and a vote in the way our founders intended. Now, today we are focusing on our state legislature, but I want to put that in context. Oh, wait, that's me. There I am, my name. We are focusing on our state legislature, but I want to put that discussion in context. Last fall, let me start again here. Thank you, Drew. We are focusing today on our state legislature, but I want to put that discussion in context. Last fall, we hosted an event for business leaders at the Pyramid Club in Philadelphia. One of our panelists was Catherine Gale, who with business productivity guru Michael Porter wrote an important study last year called Why Competition in the Politics Industry is Failing America. If you have not read that study, Google it, find it, and read it. It has very important things to say that illuminate this conversation. I have borrowed several of Catherine Gale's slides to help us put this conversation that we're having today in context. She talks about the way the US political system is designed to deliver what it currently delivers. She says it's not broken, it's very carefully constructed to keep particular people in power, to give influence to particular groups, and to shut out people like us, everyday citizens, whose votes no longer count. It is an industry that is not regulated, that is not competitive, and that has shut out any accountability. She says the actors in our political system are thriving. They are doing well financially. They are walking away with fat pensions. They are going into lobby jobs that pay them very, very well. They are thriving. But the people for whom the system is supposed to serve have never been more dissatisfied. And there is no accountability for results. The outcomes for a healthy political system would be practical and effective solutions to important challenges. Action on those policy changes, broad-based buy-in from citizens, respect for the Constitution and the rights of citizens, and our current system in Congress is not delivering those. In Congress, the number of moderates is vanishing fast, and this last round we saw this graphic was from 2015. We know in this most recent election, some of our most moderate representatives in Congress are no longer there. So it's almost bottomed out in terms of moderate voices. Problem solvers in Congress. There's a small problem solvers caucus. I think we'll hear a little bit more about that later. But they're few and growing fewer in Congress. Now, how does that relate to what goes on in Pennsylvania? It's very difficult to compare states, but we are working hard to do that because in many ways, as I said, Pennsylvania is an outlier. So a study came out 2 years ago that said the states are 6 times more productive than Congress in terms of bills passed. So in 2013, 2014, Congress passed 4% of the bills that were introduced, 4%. Pennsylvania passed 7%. So Pennsylvania is in the bottom 25% in terms of total bills passed, far behind the other full-time state legislatures. And we had the lowest percentage of bills passed of any state. The only legislative body in our nation that is more ineffective and inefficient than the Pennsylvania state legislature is Congress itself. So the question that we have for us today is how do we reinvigorate and how do we reclaim our democracy? Many people across the state and in Harrisburg assume that dysfunction is normal and inevitable, or they blame it on the other party, and we hear lots of blaming of the other party. The reality is that dysfunction has been built in by the people in charge, and they could change it in January if they chose. And our job is to insist that they change it and restore a functional democracy. The system will not be self-correcting. It's not just let's wait and see who gets elected next time. That's not going to change it. An overall reform strategy is needed, and individual steps will not be enough. Now, Catherine Gale and Michael Porter talk about the way to assess potential reform, and there are many. We all have wish lists of things we would like to see change tomorrow. They suggest that reforms must be powerful and achievable, and that we need to focus. I don't know if you have kids, but I have kids. If I give them a list of 10 things to do, nothing will get done. If I give them 2 things and say these have to be done by the time I get home, it's much more likely those things will be done. And that's the same way here. If we go to our legislators and say, we want these 20 rule changes, we want these 15 reforms, and we want you to pass these 30 bills, and we want it all done in this session, none of it is going to happen. But if we focus together and say, here are the things that must change, and have a few things that must change, I believe that we can get that done. So we started on redistricting reform before I had seen this study, but for the League of Women Voters, when we sat down and said, what is the one most important electoral reform, this was it. What is the most timely? What is the most necessary? What will change the face of Pennsylvania politics? This was it. And that's why, together with Common Cause PA, we began Fair Districts PA, and that's why the League has invested heavily in this, and that's why you're here, because you believe this too. You believe this is a foundational, essential, important reform. But we've also heard from folks that there are some other potential reforms that could help move us forward, or that we could take our energy and do a few other things as we go. We're here trying to sort that out. Is that something Fair Districts PA will do? Is the League of Women Voters going to focus in on just 2 or 3 things? Are these other organizations going to narrow their focus? Are we together going to find a way to insist on a few things? This conversation is part of, we've had some conversations already with organizational leaders. We will continue to have those conversations, but today we're focusing in on what are these powerful and achievable reforms. So this session, the panel right now that's going to begin, I invite my panelists to come on up while I announce this session. This session will be on electoral reform for expanded representation. And we had several conference calls where these leaders and some others listed out things that they're working on, things that they're thinking about, things that we might consider. There were, I believe, 17 on the list, the ones on the bottom and the ones around, and there were a few others. And then we created a survey. We invited organizational leaders to fill out the surveys. We also invited many of our Fair Districts PA volunteers to fill out the survey. And the ones that we're going to talk about today are the ones that rose to the top. There were others that people said, well, that would be nice, but it's not foundational enough. There are others that people said, I would love that. There's no way it's happening in Pennsylvania in the next 5 years. What we're looking at is in this next session, in these next 2 years, where do we put our energy for foundational change? And will Fair Districts PA be a part of that, or will we happily cheer on these other organizations? Those are questions that we're going to sort out as we move forward. So right now, we're going to hear from Micah Sims, Executive Director of Common Cause PA, and he's going to talk about some of these potential reforms. And Micah, you're going to come up here and do your buttons.
Good morning, everybody. I think that, this Saturday morning, if it was a Monday morning, it was the first day of the work week, I would accept that type of applause for Carol. But it's Saturday morning. Can we give her another round of applause for not only this, but the incredible work she does? So as indicated, my name is Micah Sims. I'm the Executive Director of Common Cause Pennsylvania, and we certainly are here in support of all the things that Fair Districts Coalition and a number of these organizations are working on. We work hand in hand with so many of them and other organizations to make sure that we are fighting for democracy, not only in Pennsylvania, but really across our nation. I think if we can all agree that right now our democracy is being threatened, yes? And so town halls like this are so important, and I want to thank you for taking the time to come out here and to participate. Common Cause, many of you know, it's nationwide. We got 1.4 million folk and 37,000 in the state, but none of that really matters if we are not changing the lives of everyday people. We can pass all of the incredible work and policies we want, but if we're not attaching what we do here today with the kitchen table issues of other people, we are missing the mark on saving our democracy. And so one of the great things about Common Cause and the League and Committee of 70 and Represent and March on Harrisburg and Fair Districts is that we don't miss that mark. That in our conversations, we're making sure that we are not just talking about suburban issues. We're not just talking about urban issues. We're not just talking about rural issues, but we're finding a way to bridge the gap between all three of those. It's not just about people of color. It's not just about whites. It's not just about males. It's not just about females. But it's about making sure we're putting together the policies that impact all Pennsylvanians. And so we are excited about the work that lies ahead. I was sitting there and I'm like, man, Carol almost depressed me for a minute. I was like, man, I almost want to go up here and like Rabbi Michael Pollack and open this up in prayer. Like, Carol just like, but she laid it out. But I believe when there are obstacles, there are opportunities. And now is the time for us to get organized and begin to seize on those opportunities to impact our democracy. Do you agree? All right. I believe in saying thank you, just like we did with Carol. I want to thank all of you for what you did on November 6th here in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. An incredible turnout on November 6th. We exercised our right to vote, did we not? And so thank you for all the incredible work that all of you did by voting, by encouraging your family, your friends to get out there and vote, and really making our reflective and representative democracy really become true here in Pennsylvania. Hey, we went from a congressional map that was 13-5 to 9-9. More reflective, again, of our voting base here in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, and that's important. And while we should applaud that, I think if we did some analysis, and we're not going to do that, I don't think on this panel, but if you did some analysis on the state rep and the state senate maps, not so much. So we still have some work to do. Again, opportunity that presents itself, but what we need people to do is to remain encouraged. And so a lot of the conversation that I'm going to have with you over the next probably 5 minutes is really about voting reform and voting access. How do we make sure that 54% turnout is the basement? Is the basement in Pennsylvania. We really need to find a way where we can get to 100% turnout in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, and I think we can do that with all of these groups and with all of you getting energized to do that. Incredible time, just you saw the turnout, incredible. And so we also really want to thank a lot of you for what you did after November 6th. Because I always tell people the most important day is not election day, it's what happens the day after. Are people going to sit around and complain, or are people going to get up and continue to fight for what they believe in? And really, we saw this take place on November 8th, where people came out in record numbers all across this state and all across this country to really defend and protect Robert Mueller and the investigation. That was an exercise that said we just don't stop at voting, but we get engaged. And so again, we applaud you, we thank you, and we need everyone to continually do that. Show up to our town hall meetings. Show up to when people are gathering in the rotunda to protest and to really and stretch their beliefs about what they believe in and make it well known. We can't just sit down every day, but we've got to get up and get active. So let me talk about voting access. The 3 things that Carol asked me to talk about are automatic voter registration, same-day registration, and no excuse absentee ballots. So let me say a little bit about automatic voter registration. So there is always the 30,000-foot view. There's always the 3,000, the 300, and for me, the 3-foot. This could possibly be answered very soon if we can find the collaboration in the United States Senate. Soon in January, there will be offered in, I think it's part of the package in H.R. 1, universal voter registration. In other words, if we know when everybody is born, because we give out birth certificates, then why not automatically, when you turn 18, you are registered to vote? Kind of makes sense, doesn't it? And when you become a citizen of this country, when you take to pledge, when you raise your hand, they ought to immediately tell you that you are now have been registered to vote in this country. So we're hopeful at the 30,000-foot level that this can be accomplished. But in case it cannot, we are still going to fight for democracy here in Pennsylvania and press for automatic voter registration. As you can see, 14 states, 14, plus the District of Columbia, have automatic voter registration. And again, this is very much a work in progress. Many of you may know that we are actually working behind the scenes on voter registration. When you now go in to sign up to get your driver's license or you do your car registration, there are other ways by which you automatically have an opportunity to register to vote. That's great and that's wonderful, but we got to press, we got to do more. So with everyone's help in here and with all of these organizations, we believe that automatic voter registration is something that should happen in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Do you agree? Let's talk about same-day registration. Now we get a little deeper. So same-day registration is that if you aren't registered on the day of election, you can show up and register to vote. They actually just passed this in Maryland. There are 17 states, including, again, D.C., California, as you see in there, that are doing that right now. North Carolina and Maryland have an asterisk because Maryland just passed it, and North Carolina has a version of it that can only be done during early voting. This is tough due really to our current systems. And so a lot of conversations that I have with legislators, with county administrators, election officials, they declare that one of the reasons that this becomes tough, Micah, is because we just do not have the technology to make that happen. And many of you can testify that we do have some antiquated voting machines across the state. As indicated, we led election protection, so we know what's happening across the state. So we know the technology is struggling in a lot of areas. But we believe that we can bring about the resources, as indicated recently, to get new voting machines, but also the technology that would make it easier for this to happen. This would make things, again, we're trying to talk about voter access. We believe that it is part of democracy that everyone should have the opportunity to vote. What if we had fair maps? And what if we passed campaign finance reform, but we are still restricting people to vote? Then we have not truly achieved democracy. We have got to fight on all of those fronts so that we really have true democracy and true reform happening in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. So same-day registration is a tough haul, but it's something we all believe in. There will be pieces of legislation that are going to be offered soon in the upcoming legislature and have been to push on this. We all believe, hopefully we all believe in it. We're going to fight for it, but it's going to be tough to do that. Let me say something about this next piece about Pennsylvania absentee ballots, and then I'm done. Many of you some of you may know, some of you may not know, that currently the ACLU has filed a lawsuit against the Department of State, Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, over absentee ballots. It is one of the craziest things, notice I said one of, the craziest things we have here in Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. So I want an absentee ballot because I'm not going to be able to get out and vote on Election Day. I won't be able to make it to my polling place. Okay. But you've got to be able to figure out if you abide by one of these rules. Now check this out. If these are the rules that by which you can get an absentee ballot in Pennsylvania. Person with an illness or physical disability, unable to go to a polling place. Okay. Person who will not be going to a polling place on Election Day because of observance of a religious holiday. Got it. Spousal dependent, residents with or accompanying a person in the military service of the United States. Okay. Member of the Merchant Marine, member of a religious organization, group attached to serving in the armed forces, spousal dependent accompanying a person employed by the Commonwealth or federal government. Okay. An individual and their spouse and dependents residing with or accompanying them with duties, occupation, or business away from their official residence on Election Day. Okay. County employee who expects that their Election Day duties will prevent. Okay. What? What if I just know that something may come up and I just want to be sure that I'm protected and that my vote is going to count and my voice is going to be heard? Why should I have to come up with an excuse? Why can't I just simply get an absentee ballot, fill it out, and mail it in? Why do I have to check a box and figure out, it's like if I've got beige shoes on with light blue socks. So not only is it about having to find an excuse, it is also about the timeline. And this is what the ACLU has raised, that you got to get it in, the deadline for it, and when it has to be received is insane. that you have to get it by the Tuesday before election, and you have to have it in, not mailed in, but actually into the county the Friday before election day. And if not, then your absentee ballot doesn't count. That is ridiculous. I don't understand how we're putting timelines like that on absentee ballots. And so we are in support of that lawsuit, and hopefully that can change. Because again, look at this, no excuse. In half of this country, hello, Pennsylvania, if I could I wish the legislature was in session. Half of the country, more than half of the country, 27 states plus DC, no excuse absentee ballots. And Pennsylvania is like, maybe, no. So we really need to pursue this. We hope that the lawsuit, and many of you know, organizing, litigation, legislation, three-pronged approach to getting things done. And we're hopeful that through one of these measures, that no excuse absentee ballots really happens in Pennsylvania. Do you agree with me? So I'm closing, I'm wrapping up, because this is all I was supposed to talk about. But let me say this. Carol raised a point about making sure we are laser focused on what we do in reference to our fighting for democracy. I do believe that we should be laser focused. But I also believe that I can chew gum and walk at the same time. Just recently in Michigan, grassroots effort, people in Michigan, got an entire package of reform bills on the ballot and were successfully voted upon. From everything from automatic voter registration to no excuse absentee ballots to ethics reform. I mean, like 11 things were incredibly passed in Michigan. And while I believe we ought to be laser focused, we also have to be aggressive in the fact that while we're asking for one or two things, we've got people that are trying to fight to suppress vote and take away 10 or 12 things. And so, yes, we ought to be laser focused, but yes, we ought to make sure that we are trying to fight for all of the things we believe that truly will impact and improve our democracy. Thank you for this time. I think we're doing question and answers later. All right, great.
Wow. I know I'm energized. I don't know about you, but it is difficult to follow one of the more dynamic speakers in Pennsylvania, but I will do my best. My name is Jill Greene. I am the new executive director of the League of Women Voters of PA. I joined this past summer as executive director. I previously served as the director of election reform. I joined the board just as the lawsuit was announced for the redistricting. So I've been kind of being pulled along by this tide, and it has been exhilarating and challenging and just the most amazing experience so far. So in addition to redistricting, the League has identified two issues that we believe have a good chance of being advanced in the General Assembly. It's open primaries and early voting. So to be blunt, 750,000 registered voters in Pennsylvania were not allowed to participate in choosing candidates for the 2017 general election. That's about 14% of Pennsylvania's population. Pennsylvania is one of 9 states that have completely closed primaries, and one of 13 that has closed primaries and does not provide for no excuse absentee ballots. So Pennsylvania makes it very difficult for voters to vote. Throughout the nation, there's a wide range of primary types with varying levels of access to non-affiliated and third-party voters. 9 states, like Pennsylvania, have closed primaries. 7 states have semi-closed primaries. 6 have semi-open primaries. 9 states have primaries that are open to non-affiliated voters. 15 have open primaries, and 3 have top 2 elections. And Nebraska has them for legislative races only. So before I talk about the League's position on primaries, I want to kind of go over how the League comes to these positions. We develop our positions through a comprehensive, member-centered study process. So at the local level or at the state level, someone will identify a problem that the league should study. So they'll form a committee and they will gather all of the materials, and the committee will study this issue in depth. Sometimes this process can be about 2 years. And they will present the information and the consensus questions to the local leagues, and the local leagues study it, talk about it, and they come to a consensus on it. So this is not a top-down from on high. We don't get our marching orders from national. We decide, based on the consensus of our membership, where our positions are. So in 2017, the league completed their election law study, and they issued their position update. The league supports abandoning the closed primary system in favor of either a semi-open or open primary that allows electors, regardless of which party they are registered with, if any, to participate in the primary of the major party of their choice. Primaries for presidential elections would have the same system as the state and local systems. So, as I said, Pennsylvania's current system is closed. Only registered voters who are Democrats or Republicans can participate in this. We have never been in favor of this system. This disenfranchises so many voters, and while there are some advantages to it, it discourages crossover voting or strategic voting, sabotaging the other party. It encourages participation in the party. The party nominees are believed to be more reflective of the party's values. Some argue that it protects the right of free expression. And in PA, it's the status quo. We don't have to change anything. But the disadvantages, and this is where our position comes from, registered independents and third-party voters cannot participate, and we simply cannot accept that. That is unacceptable to us. All voters in Pennsylvania should be allowed to participate at every level of every election. Closed primaries contribute to low voter turnout, and it encourages this polarization on both sides, that the candidates don't have to try to court independent voters, they just need to play to their base. And as we've seen, this is very damaging to our democracy, and it's unfair and it's undemocratic. This disadvantages minor party and independent candidates as well. They are not able to also participate in this part of the election process. And this is a part that a lot of people overlook. If there is a ballot question in the primary, independent and third-party voters thinking they're not allowed to vote don't get a say. So we are discouraging voters who can vote for the primary, or the ballot question on the primary, by telling them that they can't vote in the primary itself. As I mentioned, approximately 750,000 Pennsylvanians are disenfranchised at some point. This affects the party makeup in Pennsylvania. Nationwide, the national average of independents is 42%. Democrats, it's 29%, Republicans, it's 27%, and others is 2%. This suggests that the closed primary system discourages voters from registering as non-affiliated voters, even if that's what they are. I know people who are non-affiliated but feel the need to re-register as either a Republican or a Democrat just so that they can have a say in who's going to be on the ballot. And you should not have to join a party to have a say in who's going to run in the general election. It's unacceptable. So there are alternatives. A number of different models can be used to conduct primaries. Some offer a higher level of access to independent and third-party voters. These include semi-closed, semi-open, open, and top 2 or top 4 primaries. In a semi-closed primary, unaffiliated voters can privately vote for either party's ballot. It doesn't necessarily require them to re-register on election day with either party. Some states allow them to change it on election day. Some you have to do it with a something like a 30-day deadline. Semi-open primaries, unaffiliated voters can publicly declare their ballot choice at the polling place, but this becomes a de facto registration in that party. They can change it back at any time, but again, why should they have to register for a party? So in an open primary, any registered voter can vote in the primary, regardless of his or her political affiliation. Voters receive a primary ballot without declaring a party preference, and they can choose a party at the polling place on primary day. Another version was actually declared unconstitutional because it violated the party's right to expression, which is the blanket primary. All candidates from all offices, or from all parties in all offices, are on the same ballot. All voters get to vote, and the top 2 vote getters get to go to the general election. So there's another version of this that has been declared constitutional. This is the nonpartisan blanket primary, and this is the top 2 or top 4 primary. The ballot lists all the candidates from all parties in each race. The candidates can state their party preference, so that gets around that, the parties not being able to exercise their right to expression. So again, the top 2 or top 4 vote getters advance to the general election regardless of their party, and this was ruled permissible by the Supreme Court. So what works for PA? Well, not closed primaries. That does not work for us. So we support open, semi-open, or top 2 primaries that allow voters to choose who will be on the ballot without having to register for either of the parties. And the system should be the same for presidential elections as it is for state and local. Before I move on to that, I don't have a slide for these, but I do want to mention that there is some interest in the General Assembly. At the end of the last session, Senator Scarnati introduced Senate Bill 1234, very easy to remember, and it was referred to the Senate State Government Committee, where it sat. And yeah, we're going to hear that a lot. Voters would, this is the kind of primary where voters, if you were Democratic or Republican, you would vote for a Democratic or Republican ballot, but independent third-party voters could declare which one they wanted to vote for. An earlier session, a Bill 216 was introduced by Senator Schwank. This also went to State Government Committee, where it's probably still sitting. In the House, Representative Reed introduced House Bill 2448, which would also provide for a semi-open primary. So there is some interest here. So this is why it's one of the things that the League has identified as our goal for the next legislative session. There are people who are interested in this. We just need to figure out a way to work with them. The other position that the League is supporting is early voting. In 37 states in DC, including 3 states that have all mail voting, any qualified voter may cast a ballot in person during a designated period prior to Election Day. PA is not one of those states. In 20 states, voters must offer an excuse as to why they need an absentee ballot. PA is one of those states. So some states even offer permanent absentee ballot lists. But in PA, it is you vote on one day at your designated precinct, and if you need to get an absentee ballot, you must provide an excuse. And this is why in Pennsylvania you see incredibly long lines. You hear of people who wanted to vote, but they couldn't because they couldn't get off of work. I used to work in the restaurant industry. I know a lot of people who work 12-hour shifts regularly. They're not able to get out to vote. So they regularly do not get a say in what happens in their own government because they can't get off of work. And Pennsylvania does not require employers to allow people time off to vote. So again, Pennsylvania makes it incredibly difficult to exercise your right to vote. And these are some of the long lines in Philadelphia and State College. They are very familiar to Pennsylvania. So, Pennsylvania's position on early voting, we support measures to make voting more accessible by providing any registered voter with alternatives to casting a ballot on Election Day. The one we are going to focus on is in-person early voting. The Absentee ballot, we think the absentee ballot reforms are going to be a bit more challenging, and I'll explain why in a minute. Actually, I'll explain why right now. In the PA Constitution, as Micah very succinctly explained, it is spelled out who can request an absentee ballot. Even if we are able to change this with legislation, there's going to be challenges to it. So it's going to be a time-consuming process. It is going to take a while. So we believe that in-person early voting is probably going to be an easier to attain goal at this point. So evidence suggests that early voting works best when it's offered in many locations over at least 2 weeks, preferably more, and offers voters the opportunity to vote at night and on weekends. We forget sometimes that we have people, our neighbors, who are working different shifts. They're sleeping during the day, so having your polling places only open during the day, during the week, isn't going to work for them. So there's some criticisms about early voting. One of them is voter fraud, and I need to say this, unfortunately, because some people still don't believe it. There is no evidence to suggest that early voting, either in person or by mail, is subject to voter fraud. In fact, there are very few instances of voter fraud overall. So somebody should tell DC this. So the voter fraud argument is a non-starter for us. We don't even consider that a valid criticism. Another issue is the October surprise, and this one, you can see the relevance of the argument, but really, how many people would really change their vote over something that happens in October, is revealed in October, right before the election? I think we're all kind of getting used to this aha moment thing, and I don't really think that it's a valid reason to not allow people to vote early. And then there's a criticism that it will result in a decrease in voter turnout, and this is actually backed up a little bit by some studies. Some studies have shown that early voting does depress the vote rather than increasing the vote, and this is a study done by the Pew Center. But there are some caveats to that. This happens when early voting is implemented on its own without other reforms. When it's implemented with other reforms, early voting can help make voting more convenient and can encourage, over time, voter turnout. There's also the time factor in these studies. In longitudinal studies over a longer period of time, it's found that early voting does, in fact, actually lead to an increase over time in voter turnout. And maybe more importantly, voter retention. Being able to vote in person early and vote by mail actually retains voters more than not letting them. The Election Assistance Commission study of no-excuse absentee mail-in voting and early in-person voting on voter turnout from 1972 to 2008 found that controlling for other factors, that's the important part when you hear these criticisms, make sure you understand that when you control for other factors, in-person early voting and no-excuse absentee ballot has a greater increase in turnout than they would have if they had not implemented this. And it's a 3% increase, but 3% is good enough for me, I think. So the takeaway here is that early voting is a very popular election reform. In the weeks leading up to the election, in my office, I got plenty of emails and plenty of phone calls from people. Are you going to do something about early voting? We want early voting. We want to be able to go and vote early, get absentee ballots without having to give an excuse. And yeah, the answer is that is definitely one of our priorities. It has the potential to make elections more convenient, and that in itself is a good enough reason. And if it's a larger part of a larger election reform effort, it does increase voter turnout. And that's all I have. So thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of the day.
Hello, everybody. Like it says on the screen, I'm Peter Ouellette, chapter leader with Represent Us, Pennsylvania. We also started a little organization some of you may know about, have heard about, Clean Money Squad, PA. What we did was approach candidates for office through the primaries and the general election and ask them to endorse the main document of Represent Us, which is the American Anti-Corruption Act. We're very happy to have some of those folks in the audience here. Hi, Steve. And I would encourage you to, check that out. Take a look at the list out there. We hope that becomes a core group within the state legislature to help us enact these reforms and support each other while they're doing so. Something else I do, which is really interesting based on what we were just talking about, I am the vice chair of the Luzerne County Board of Elections. That has been quite an education for me. And I'm happy to say that I can honestly state that our supervisor of elections in Luzerne County is very dedicated to fair and free and open elections, despite the fact that we still use DREs. So that all aside, I was asked to do a presentation or talk about private money in politics. And my first reaction to that was, end it. Okay? But we can't do that. It's a very complicated issue, and it revolves around, we've had money in politics from the beginning of the country and the beginning of the Commonwealth. What has happened over time, though, is that the money coming from individual voters has been discouraged and fallen back to a great degree. We saw some really encouraging things happen during this election cycle, this midterm election cycle, in the number of candidates that swore off private money other than small individual donations. That's a really encouraging thing, because that brings voters back to their position as those who should be represented by their government. The bad thing that happened this year is that it was the most expensive midterm elections in the history of the country. Something north of $518 million was spent in the federal elections. Of that, something north of $300 million was from 2 donors. How does that feel? How does that make you feel about the power of your vote? We're constantly reminded. It's the only thing we have. Get out and vote. Get out and vote. And we can put all the mechanical things in place to make it difficult to vote. Poll taxes and a number of things. We all know the things that come up. The absentee ballots. Here's an interesting thing going back to the absentee ballot in Pennsylvania. You can apply for an absentee ballot, but if somebody sees you and you're available to vote on election day, they can throw your ballot out. And that happens that's Pennsylvania. It's bizarre. So, we have a huge amount of money. Something north of $91 million was spent in Pennsylvania elections. And I would say, when you go out and you talk to your friends and neighbors, and they say, I'm just not that into politics. Well, there's a number of people who are. And they're landlords, insurance companies, drug companies in this state, and any bankers, any number of industries in this state, fracking, who are very interested in politics. But you have to acknowledge that when you're in a system where so much money comes from so few people, to influence elections, you can't help but understand that the average person, not in this room, because we're all kind of wonky here, you know, and that's something that we all have to remember too, is we're all kind of wonky. This means something to us, and we've become sort of dedicated to it. Not everybody wants to or can. But you can see how that kind of situation is going to be the most discouraging thing to get a person out to actually cast a vote. So, this system has, we have an election system and a campaign finance system in this Commonwealth. The elections haven't been touched since 1937, except for a few tweaks. We have something in this Commonwealth that I would say that the majority of citizens in Pennsylvania do not know, is that there are no limits on what an individual can contribute to a campaign in this state. No limit. You can only give them $100 of cash at a time. But other than that, there's no limit. So what this does, you know, and the other aspect of it too is that it just kind of erodes something I would call, I mean, remember when we were, you know, when we were younger, at least when I was younger, we had civics class, and we learned all about how our government worked. And it sounded pretty good. You know, you go out and you vote for your representative, and they represent you in your legislature, and that's all good. And you can bring your problems to them, and they'll listen, and they'll act, and everything is wonderful. Well, we were victims of a fraud. And that through the last year, when I had worked with fair districts, cooperated with fair districts and did some lobbying and for the independent commission, it became painfully obvious to me when I worked with some folks who had never gotten into this before. And that's one of the wonderful things that Carol has done. She has, and fair districts have motivated so many people to get involved. But when you'd sit across the desk from your local legislator, and you haven't really looked into politics, you're still operating on that civics class model, and you sit across them and they say, I really applaud what you folks have done and what you are doing. But let me tell you what's going to happen. And they lay it out for you. And in fact, this is exactly what happened in one of my meetings with a legislator in his office in his district. And he laid out exactly what happened. And this was in February. Now, the reason that happens is because the legislators are not beholden to their constituents. In very few ways are they. We have to turn that around, and one of the ways to turn that around is to at least put limits on campaign contributions. We can't end it. We can't say no. There are, you know, when we look at Citizens United, because everybody knows about Citizens United, oh, that's just the latest round of I don't know, treason. And you know, and the floodgates that opened, when you look at that and subsequent decisions that have opened things up to greater and greater amounts of money being spent, and we see this. I mean, you have to be blind not to be able to see this. And the discouragement on the average voter for the average voter is just tremendous. But it strays so far from something I would call the original intent of legislators. We learned what the original intent of the government and our representatives were when we were in grade school. And we hold on to that, and we need to hold on to that. So we have to look at this situation, also avoiding some of the constitutional issues that come into play, because there are constitutional interests. There are First Amendment problems with how we go about reforming this system. There are problems with freedom of association. But we can work around those things. We may not be able to change them completely, but we can bring other systems into play that might be able to negate those. And I think our next speaker is going to get into that. But what we've built now, what we've built now is a culture of dependence in our legislators so that they're no longer dependent on their constituents. They're given a choice that comes through a primary of who they get to vote for, and they often aren't included in helping that person get elected other than by casting their vote. Their choice is limited from the get-go. And when the parties come around to help out candidates, we get people who want to run, and usually they want to run with the best of intentions. But often the first question is how much money can you raise? I don't care about your positions. I don't care about your integrity. The first question now is how much money can you raise? That's what makes you a viable candidate. That's how the media sees a viable candidate, and we saw this over and over again in this past election cycle. We look at a revolutionary candidate, Ocasio-Cortez. She didn't get the coverage in the media that she might have gotten had she been a more conventional candidate, because there are all kinds of different moneyed interests that play into this thing. So we're up against a huge machine. The media is part of the machine because they make money on it. The individual industries are part of it because they make money on it. And what tends to happen then is you get a candidate, and I have to wonder when some of these candidates get into office. I'm thinking of one of our candidates who is the first candidate to sign the American Anti-Corruption Act in Congress, is Susan Wild from the state of Pennsylvania. She is the first and only member of the Congress or the Senate to endorse the act. That's astounding. And it's pretty great for Pennsylvania. But understand what she's going to be up against when she gets to Washington. One of the first things that the party is going to require of her, and I don't care, it's Republican, it's Democrat, it doesn't matter. They are going to be required to fundraise for the party. And estimates on that fundraising, that dialing for dollars, go anywhere from 30% to 70% of their time. This is outrageous. It's outrageous. What happened to original intent? It's gone. So, the representatives, and I use Ocasio-Cortez again as an example, because she did use small dollar donations. So it is possible, even in a situation where there are no voucher systems or no matching funds, if you can energize people in a small enough, because remember, the only people who get to vote for you are the people in your district. But the people outside your district, they can spend a lot of money telling you what that candidate is about, and it often drowns out what the candidate says about themselves. So you don't really get a real clear picture. We get 30-second shots of what a bad person they are. And that's, again, that's part of the money in politics problem and the campaign finance in problem. So what we want to do, we want to give an option, at least, to candidates so that they can be less dependent or independent of these big money contributions. It doesn't mean they're going to end, but it does mean that they have another means to get to their goal, and another means, once they're there, to not be tempted. We're talking about human nature here. We're all people. And one of the things that government is supposed to do is it's supposed to protect us from our baser instincts. And it's not doing that very well when it comes to campaign finance. Because people can be given whatever, in unlimited quantities in practical purposes. They do have to report, but who reads the reports? That's another aspect of it. We get a lot of things, we get a lot of people talking about, well, transparency. Transparency will help. Transparency will help. Transparency will help if you go and find out what voter does. A bunch of you might, but your next door neighbor certainly is not. What they're listening to is 30 seconds of negative ads through each election cycle. Something else that's going on. We're talking about reducing the amount of money in politics and reducing the amount of money. I just want National Association of Business PACs just had a meeting in August talking about how they're going to reform the idea of business, of PACs, and give them a more positive spin. And one of the other things that they're looking at is doubling the limit for contributions to PACs. So the trend is that way, and we need to concentrate on bringing the trend or giving an alternative. All right? Thank you.
Hello. My name is Michael Pollack. I'm with March on Harrisburg. I did not bring any slides, so don't confuse me with Peter. Oh, hey, thank you. When I'm asked to speak on a Saturday, I think it's a sermon, and so we don't bring slides into synagogues. This isn't a thing. So my father is a doctor, and growing up in Maryland, gifts used to be legal to doctors. And growing up, we used to go to 3 or 4 Baltimore Orioles games a year. We used to go to a few Washington Redskins games. We would go to some Capitals games and some Wizards games. And growing up, this was amazing because these tickets were the best tickets. We used to sit in the luxury boxes. And I always wondered, I don't wonder anymore, but who sits in those luxury boxes? And I used to get to go in them. And then one year, sometime late middle school, early high school, the law changed in Maryland. And pharmaceutical industry representatives could no longer give unlimited gifts to doctors. And those games stopped. And one day I asked my dad, so how many Orioles games are we going to this year? Did he get the good tickets? Did he get the Yankees game? Did he get the Red Sox game? Or are we going to have to see the Devil Rays again? Ugh. And he said, they've stopped, and it's probably for the best. Because he said that sometimes when he's writing out a prescription, he looks down at the pen, and the pen will say AstraZeneca on it, because pharmaceutical reps give out a whole lot of pens because doctors write prescriptions. And he said that he would look down at that pen, he'd see AstraZeneca, and sometimes he would be thinking more about the ball game and the great time he had with the pharma rep than he would about the patient, and that's not okay. It says in Deuteronomy, and this problem is so old, this problem of gifts. It says in Deuteronomy, and I'm going to give you the original here. It says, "Lo tikach shochad, ki shochad ya'aver einei chachamim v'yasalef divrei tzadikim," which means do not take a bribe, because do not take a bribe, because a bribe blinds the eyes of the wise and twists the words of the righteous. And this was a problem in the ancient world, and the prophets of the Bible ranted and raved against this. Isaiah cried out, "Your rulers are rebels, partners with thieves. They chase after gifts. The widow and the orphan's case does not come before them." Ezekiel cries out, "In you are people who take bribes to shed blood." The Talmud, which is a great work of Jewish legal theory and philosophy, about 1,500 years ago or so it was written, and it goes into this, and it asks the question, what is a bribe? How do you define a bribe? What makes a gift a bribe? And they tell 4 quick stories, and I want to play a quick game with you all. Call out bribe or no bribe after each of these stories. It's going to be harder than you think, maybe. The judge is getting into town. They used to have a canal system. He used to ferry into town on a boat. The judge is coming into town on the boat, steps off, and as the judge is stepping off, somebody offers their hand to help the judge off the boat. The judge turns to the person and says, "Thank you. Who are you?" And the person says, "Oh, my name is so-and-so, and I have a case before the court today." Bribe or no bribe? Bribe. The judge is at home, it's a Thursday morning, and the food delivery person, the vegetable delivery person comes. And that person usually comes on Friday, but here they are on Thursday. And the judge says, "What are you doing here?" And the person says, "Well, I have a case in court today." Bribe or no bribe? There's a judge sitting in the street, a bird lands on the judge's head, somebody comes along and shoos the bird off of the judge's head, and the judge says, "Who are you?" And the person says, "I have a case in court today." Bribe or no bribe? Bribe. The 4th one, the judge spits on the ground. It's the dusty desert. This was written in ancient Iraq. Judge spits on the ground to get some dust out of their mouth. Somebody comes along and kicks some dust over it, and the judge says, "Thank you, who are you?" And the person says, "I have a case in court today." Bribe or no bribe? Bribe. And then they ask the question at the end again, what is a bribe? And it's a Hebrew play on words. And it translates to when you become one with the other person. That's a bribe. When you look down at the pen and instead of thinking about the patient, you're thinking about your buddy. That's a bribe. In Pennsylvania, we have unlimited gifts. And I call them gifts just because that's what they're called in that other building, but they're bribes. You can gift anything to anyone. This means a new car, this means a trip to the Super Bowl, this means trips to the Kentucky Derby, this means endless wining and dining, this means roof repairs. This means anything. This means cash. Right now, up in New York City, there's a lot of bribery happening. Now, not every legislator takes these bribes, but many do. And the higher up you go on the ladder of leadership, the more likely you are to find this systemic lifestyle of bribery. Now, we're working to push for a gift ban because we need to ban these bribes. It's that simple. And we've had a little bit of success. In the House, we actually got a bill voted out of committee in the House State Government Committee. Now to add the cynical piece to it, because this is Darryl Metcalfe's committee, right? They don't just vote things out. They voted it out at the end of September knowing it would never get a full House vote because the session was ending. But progress. In the Senate, we're looking forward to having the gift ban be a centerpiece of Senator Fulmer's ethics package reform. We're going to have hearings on a gift ban in the Senate this year. In the House, who knows? Who knows? You never know what's going to happen in the House. One time we were lobbying for the gift ban and had a meeting, and I wasn't actually personally in this meeting, but everybody who was has told me this story about 10 times. It was a meeting with a representative who did not want to talk about this issue, as many do not. And our citizen lobbyist brought up the gift ban, and this representative pivoted. He did something that representatives do when they don't want to address the issue. They talk about everything else in the world but what is right in front of you. And they'll throw out something controversial, hoping you jump on one side of it, and they can just argue you out of the room or flatter you out of the room if you agree with them. And so this representative decided to talk about ivory poaching. And we said, hey, we're here to talk about the gift ban. And he said, why are they coming down so hard on ivory poachers? What the hell are you talking about? We said, we're here to talk about the gift ban. And he said, why is the Department of the Treasury and Commerce right now coming down hard on these ivory poachers in Africa? They're just trying to make a buck. This is economic tyranny. Here to talk about the gift ban. Can we get you to sign on to this? Do this again. Gift ban. Again, he goes off. He pulls out a black and white picture of himself standing over a dead elephant with a rifle. And he says, back in the 80s, I shot this elephant and it fed the village for a month. This was the best thing I've ever done. What's so wrong with this? And he was wearing a wedding ring. And so our citizen lobbyists, as they're trained to do, said, Representative, are you married? And he said, yes, I am. We said, well, a representative democracy is a lot like a marriage. It's a relationship between governed and government, between citizen and state. And right now, that relationship is in a lot of trouble. We don't trust each other. We do not talk well of each other. We insult each other. Our language is vitriolic. It's bombastic. Something is wrong here. And we can't get divorced. That's called a failed state. We're not getting a divorce here. It's not an option. And we need to repair this relationship. And one thing that'll really help is if you stop taking these gifts. Because I can't trust you so long as you take these gifts. And his face changed, and we got a supporter. Because what it comes down to, and what we're talking about here, with all of these issues, there's two sides to them. One side is the divorce lawyer side. Our job is to serve as divorce lawyers. We are facilitating the divorce between special interests, corporations, big donors, and our government. Right now, they are thick as thieves, as the saying goes. And our job is to divorce them, separate them. The gift ban will help do that. On the flip side, we're marriage counselors. Our job is to reconnect government to people, to rebuild, to build for the first time, really, that honest and productive relationship between citizen and state, government and governed. We are divorce lawyers, we are marriage counselors. Campaign finance reform, we are divorce lawyers. Automatic voter registration, we are marriage counselors. We are disconnecting and reconnecting. That's our job. A policy that helps do that, I was asked to address two policies, gift ban and public campaign financing. Public campaign financing helps do both of those. It's both a divorce bill and a marriage bill. And actually, I'm going to stop calling it public campaign financing because we have a double red state legislature right now, so these are citizen-funded elections. Got that? Okay. So citizen-funded elections. If it flips, we'll go back to public campaign financing. Citizen-funded elections help politicians, help public servants not be reliant on big money and help them connect with we the people at the same time. So there are many different forms of citizen-funded elections. One is a matching fund system. New York City has this. I believe theirs is a 6-to-1 match, but I think they just changed it. Just went up a little bit. Now they have a 7-to-1 match, and I think there's also an 8-to-1 tier. When I say tier, it means something like if I give up to $100, that gets matched 8-to-1. If I'm giving $200, that gets matched 6-to-1. Right, so that's one way to tier the matching. And matching funds have a tremendous impact. They get people involved, and in New York City, it went from a mostly white, older male city council in the 80s to a much more diverse city council today. And that's frankly because in our society, who holds wealth? Old white guys. So if you have public campaign financing, you open it up beyond that. Another system is the block grant system. So in Maine, they have a block grant system, meaning you raise a certain amount of money from a certain amount of small donors, and the state then gives you a chunk of change to fund your campaign. And that has incredible impacts. In Maine, before they had this system in place, advocates had been trying to push a consumer responsibility law for years, a law making it so that, a producer responsibility law, a law making it so that if you produce toxic things, you have to you're responsible for them. They couldn't get that through. Citizen-funded elections comes along, and you have people in the legislature all of a sudden who are no longer dependent on the big polluters. So what do? They pass that bill. That bill has kept 1 ton of lead per Maine resident out of the Maine environment. Huge impact. Deb Simpson retired a few years ago as one of the most popular legislators in Maine history. She was a single mother waitress before she ran. Everybody in the town liked her. Everybody who worked with her liked her. She was very respected. She thought, I can't run for office. I'm a waitress. No chance. Somebody told her, hey, we have this block grant system. She said, great, I can raise $5 from 50 people. I see 50 people every day, and a lot of them tip me. This is easy. I'll do this in a week. She did. She ended up retiring as the chair of the Senate Oversight Committee, one of the most beloved legislators in the state. Never would have had access were it not for citizen-funded elections. And the third system, and this is the one we're really interested in here, because it's the most effective. It's also the newest. Vouchers. We're thinking about calling them freedom vouchers or democracy vouchers or something like that, but the idea is pretty simple. In Seattle, every voter gets 4 vouchers, each worth $25, and they can give those vouchers to any candidate who qualifies for the ballot. So all of a sudden, you have candidates for Seattle City Council not knocking on the door for Amazon, Boeing, and Microsoft trying to get those big dollars, but going around and talking to people. And homeless people are giving money to candidates and are being heard by candidates. And the Seattle City Council is considering a domestic workers' bill of rights and tenant reform and affordable housing and things that matter to people because they know they can operate without Amazon's blessing. They can operate without Microsoft's go-ahead. They can operate without Boeing's money. And that's hugely transformational. I mean, what this policy does is it fundamentally affects the intersection of economics and politics. It makes it so that you don't have to have a whole lot of money or access to a whole lot of money to participate. Anybody can. Anybody who's actually liked by voters can be elected by voters. Really, that's such a concept, isn't it? Who knew that this was possible? So I'll just end by saying thank you to the organizers of this event. And really, there is so much to do. I mean, as has already been said, there's 20 to 30 plus policy ideas that we need to get through to get to a functioning democracy. And the goal is, working with allies, we're just going to knock them off 1 by 1, 2 by 2, until brick by brick, bill by bill, we have built a functioning representative democracy in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And we're going to do it.
We are taking questions, but the only questions we've received so far for this panel have to do with redistricting reform. So those are going to wait till after lunch, which is good because these people are wonderful, but they have answered all your questions and taken more time than we were allotting. So thank you all. What we're going to do now is we have Senator Franklin Curry, who was a past representative, a past senator. He actually pushed through the People's Right to Clean Air and Clean Water Amendment here in Pennsylvania. He's written 3 books about Pennsylvania politics. One, a primer for Pennsylvania legislators, Why Are You Here? One about the constitutional amendment process, what he did there, Clean Politics, Clean Streams. And just this past year, he wrote one on gerrymandering, A Guide to Congressional Redistricting, Dark Money, and the U.S. Supreme Court. I've asked him just to make a few remarks to kind of pull this together for us. The idea of gerrymandering, the idea of money, the idea of citizen involvement, and the way our legislature works. I've told him he has 5 minutes. We'll see if he can hold to that. And then we're going to break for lunch after that, so stay tuned.
Thank you, Carol. I must say, Carol has learned the secret of keeping former senators' speeches short. She puts them between their speech and lunch. But I also want to say I feel very well qualified to be here because I graduated successfully from the civics class in the junior high school of Sunbury in the early 50s, and I also graduated from the civics class taught by Senator Martin Murray in the state Senate and Speaker Herb Feynman and Leroy Irvis in the state house, and it's been quite an education. But what I would like to do is tie what about money into the whole question of redistricting, and as Carol said, keep it short. Now, everybody's pleased with the fact that in the last election, the redistricting law, or the redistricting plan done by the state Supreme Court, which the League of Women Voters prosecuted, gave that a much fairer congressional districting than we've ever had. It came out 9-9. That's wonderful. 4 of them were women. I loved it. It was great. But there's another thing we didn't, that people don't look at it as much, and that is who controls the House, the state House, and the state Senate. Now, the Democrats did pick up some. In the House, it's now only 110 to 91, and then the Senate is 29 to 21. But the point is, if you're going to pass the legislation, you have to have the votes in each House. The first class I took in the legislature was math. You got to start in the House, 1 plus 1 plus 1, till you get to 102. Without 102, you're not passing anything. In the Senate, it goes 1, 2, up to 26. And as you can see from the numbers, it's 29 Republicans and 19 Democrats, or 21 Democrats. You still got 5 to go, if assuming all the Democrats are with you. And in the House, it's 110 to 91. So again, you need 12, assuming, and I don't know if that's a good assumption or not, that all the Democrats are with you. So that brings us to where we are with trying to get what Carol and this organization is trying to do is pass legislation to give us a citizens redistricting commission. And that is the subject, of course, of this book which I've written and which Carol kindly mentioned. In writing this book, I tried to cover all the different aspects of it, the history, the constitutional law, and how it works out in each state, and what citizens can do about it. And I will have copies of these outside afterward. If anybody wants to buy one, I'll be glad to sign it and charge you only the printer's cost. But the one thing that I want to get into that Carol mentioned is dark money. Because people don't realize how dark money is going to affect getting that 102 and that 26. And let me tell you just a little bit about dark money. It started, as one of the speakers said, with the Citizens United case. Let me take a moment just to explain that case to you. The Citizens United is a private nonprofit corporation in Maryland formed by the Koch brothers to advocate their political views. And this is perfectly legal. There's nothing immoral about what they did, but they did it. And what they wanted to do was produce a movie. Maybe you've heard of it. How many have heard of the movie Hillary the Movie? Well, this was produced by this organization as an independent expenditure. They wanted to produce the movie and show it around the country without any reference to candidates, approval, or political committees. Now, under the McCain-Feingold law in effect at that time, the only money they could get to finance this had a cap on it of $1,000 or $2,000. They'd have to report in who put up the money. And they thought this was unconstitutional. Well, they took it to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the U.S. Supreme Court decided that the Citizens United organization was right. It is unconstitutional. This is the Supreme Court talking, not me now. I'm just reporting, not advocating. But the Supreme Court said, as violation of the First Amendment, and anybody could spend any amount of money they want on independent expenditures. And if it was done through a 5063 organization under the Internal Revenue Code, they didn't have to just explain or report who the donors are. So as that result, you got all this money coming into politics. It's not controlled by either candidate or the committees. It's done by outsiders who just want to spend money because they believe in what they're advocating. And in this last congressional election, I'm sure you saw lots of independent ads. I guess ad comes on, and so that says paid for by America's First Committee or DLLC, Democratic Leadership Conference Committee. Those campaign ads are paid for by an independent outside group as independent expenditures, and the candidates and the committees don't have anything to do with it. Now, how does this get down to state elections, and how does this get to affect what this Carol and this organization, the PA committee, wants to do? It does this. When these independent expenditures can be made on local expenditures for state legislature, for state senate. And that's where I think they will be spent in the 2020 election. Because they want to control the people who want to keep the legislature in the Republican hands are going to put a lot of money into independent expenditures to elect a Republican House and a Republican Senate. Now, how will we know if they're doing it? Well, that's a problem. One of the good things I did in my book was talk to Denise Roth Barber. Denise runs the Institute for Public Money in for Money in State Politics. She and a staff of 23 in Helena, Montana, tried to find out how money is going in every state for legislatures and statewide offices. And I'll never forget, she says, Mr. Curry, when it comes to following the reporting of independent expenditures, it's a mess. We don't know how to follow it because the states are so inconsistent. And if you look on page 44 of my book, you'll see a map that this institute in Montana put together showing all 50 states and grading them from A to F. Anybody want to guess where Pennsylvania came out on that? Here's the map. You're right, we got an F. And so did 24 other states. So we're not alone. And in the back of the book, it shows the criteria they used on which to make that judgment. Now, the problem, therefore, is when we go into the next election, we may not know where these independent expenditures are being made for House and Senate candidates. I'm not talking Congress now. I'm talking about the people who will decide who will be in Congress. The League of Women Voters won a great Supreme Court decision. And that map that we're so proud of expires with the 2020 election. The court order is not going to go beyond 2020 unless a new court decides another case. And that's because in 2020, we're going to have another census. And then you have to have a new map drawn for congressional seats. And we're probably going to lose a seat because Texas, Florida, Arizona, and California gain population far more rapidly than we do. So we'll probably lose and they'll probably gain. But the point is, who then gets to draw that map? And that's what this Fair Districts PA fight is all about. Who does it? Well, let me tell you who's going to do it. Unless Fair Districts PA succeeds in getting an amendment through, or some law through to change it, it starts back at square one. The legislature of Pennsylvania draws the map in the first instance. Then they send it to the governor. Now, the good news is we have a Democratic governor. In 2010, we got that awful monstrosity with the 2711 maps. There was a Republican House, a Republican Senate, and a Republican governor. And that bill was passed in 15 days. I got to tell you, I spent 14 years in the legislature. I never saw a bill faster than that. I mean, that makes speed of lightning look slow in legislative terms. It really does. The bill was conceived in secret, introduced, and then all passed in 15 days and in and out. No public hearing, nothing. Well, things that Governor Wolf's presence should have some impact on that. But the point is, you're back to what the legislature will do and what the governor will sign, and hopefully the governor can negotiate something. But we don't know. The main thing is, you're going to see, I think, a lot of this independent money being spent for these House and Senate seats. Now, the Pennsylvania Department of State does have a form that the independent donors, independent expendors, I can't get my Latin right here, I have to file. It's done by the person, the independent expender, not paid by the, you don't go to look at the campaign committee reports. It's independent. It doesn't go to political committee reports because it's independent. The campaign independent expendors are supposed to file a report. But if they hold off till the last 2 weeks before the election, then start sending in letters or something like that, nasty mailings. They don't file the report till after the election, and then you won't know what's in it, maybe. So there's no way we're going to know in advance how much money is going to be spent, and that bothers me. But look, you've got a great challenge here in Pennsylvania. I have had the pleasure of talking to the League of Women Voters and Common Cause throughout the United States, and I've learned there are two sets of states. Those that have a ballot box initiative, like those in Michigan, which was just talked about by Brian Sims. That's Michigan. They can go to the ballot without going through the legislature. Every state that has one of these commissions lately has gone that route. You go through the ballot process. You don't go through the legislature. But there are 24 states, like Pennsylvania, where your only choice is to go through the legislature. No matter what anybody tells you, you still got to get 102 and 26. And that's why you have such a difficult job. And I want to encourage you. I've talked to the people in Texas. I've talked to Carolina. And these folks, they're just like you, Common Cause and the League of Women Voters. They want to win. They want to do what you have to do, climb Mount Everest, politically speaking. But I think you can do it. I know you can do it. Look how far you got last year. Carol and the organization did a magnificent job getting that bill as far as it did. So my words to you before we go to lunch, before the Senate quiets down, is don't give up. Keep going. The top of the mountain's in sight. You've got the enthusiasm. You've got the leadership in Carol and others here today. And you got the cause, your greatest cause of all kind in politics, giving people equal representation and having their voice heard in Washington and Harrisburg. So go for it.